Hi everyone, I'm Tracey, the Developer Relations Manager for Moneyhub, and I'm here today to talk about Inside Out, the path for bringing your internal API out to an external audience. But first up, a little bit about Moneyhub. See, Moneyhub, we have a central mission, and that is to enhance the lifetime financial wellness of people, their communities, and their businesses. And we do this through our app, services, and most relevant to me and this conference, our API. We work to build products and services with some of the most recognizable financial institutions in the world, and we're quite good at it. And for us, in the API line of business, open finance and open banking are our bread and butter, because we've been building with and for open banking and open finance standards since day one. It's what we live and breathe, and importantly, enable you to engage with through the Moneyhub API. So we'll take a little look at the agenda for today, going through having the internal API, documentation, the SDKs, education, pricing, and marketing. So let's get started. So you have an internal API. You're working at a company, and as with every place, often tools and services get built to solve little problems that you or your team may have that will make your lives easier. And as time goes on, little bits and bobs start getting added to it. Extra functions, extra endpoints, more features, extra code, all of that shebang. And after some time has passed, you might start to think, oh golly, this could actually be useful. Could it be useful for other people? And you start to have chats about how you might take this internal API and tooling and bring it to the world. Where does it fit in your organization? How does it work alongside your existing products and services? Is there a big enough market to justify the time it will take to bring this to market? Those are the conversations you're going to have when you decide that you want to go and do it. And those conversations can be difficult, but you will have them. And if all goes well, you'll get to a point where you decide as a team, yes, we're going to do this. So where do you start? Because sure, this thing is useful, but it works based on the needs of a tiny set of people, all of whom should have at least some context of its usage. But that's the problem. It wasn't built for other people. And unless you're very lucky, the shape that it's currently in isn't necessarily going to be the thing that's going to work with people outside of your organization. So how do we get started? With documentation. You see, documentation is your keystone. It's the foundation upon which everything else that you will do will sit. It will drive your decisions, it will drive your marketing, and ultimately what people build on top of your API. So where is it? Well, that's the question, and it's one that you have to answer fast. When APIs grow organically, as often they do when they start off internally, the documentation can be thin, messy, wrong, sometimes straight up non-existent. And that can be because it's changed so much, so quickly, that not every little feature or bug fix or change gets documented in favor of shipping those changes. And you need to fix that. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But the very first step you have is figure out what you've got already. And check that it's right. You see, when you've managed to put your API out into the world, all dressed up and ready to sing and dance and make the world a better place, the first thing developers are going to look for isn't your marketing, it isn't your code, it's going to be the docs. And if those docs are wrong or incomplete or just straight up not there, developers aren't going to ask you for help. They're busy people. They're going to look for something else that can do the job they need to get done. You've lost them at the first hurdle, and it can be a lot of work to get them back. So how do you start with documentation? Well, find out what there is already. Speak to the people who've already built on top of the API or have worked directly on it to date. At the very least, they should have an idea of what makes it tick. And at best, if you're lucky, they may even have written something down. And then read it. It sounds glaringly obvious, but you'd be surprised how often people skip this step. Once you've gotten as much documentation as you can find, sit down and read it. Check for sentences that might be a little bit tricky or for offhand references to techniques or endpoints or technologies that haven't been explained, and then correct those. Remove all assumed knowledge. You have no idea of the background that someone coming to your docs for the first time has. So don't assume in your docs that they know this or that. That's not to say you've got to sit there and explain how an HTTP client works in your documentation, but you should at least do the work to give people pointers and link to docs where there may be ambiguity or a required but not necessarily obtained skill set. And then finally, build with the docs. You've done your comprehension checks. You've made sure that nothing vague or is unexplained. Now is the time to try and build something following the docs. It could be anything. A hello world will do. But if you can't build something following the documentation that you have right in front of you, then there's no way someone from outside your organization is going to be able to either. By trying to build something, you're going to find the gaps and the holes. You're going to find the places where people may get stuck. And you're going to be able to patch those gaps ahead of time before anyone ever sees the documentation. And that's how you're going to get your first draft. The first iteration of documentation that explains what your API can do. And of course, this isn't final. Your API will change over the coming days, weeks, months, and maybe even years. You need to make sure they stay up to date. But how do you do that? Well, there are a couple of techniques and processes that can be applied to try and keep your docs in line. But I like to keep things simple. I like to do it with one rule. If you want to ship it, you have to document it. Documentation isn't an optional step or a nice to have in the development cycle. It's the final mandatory step before a feature goes live. No docs, no deployments. By having this rule firm and upfront, your teams will work in that they need the time to do this through their development cycles to make sure that they can still ship on time. And again, documentation is the foundation of what you're bringing to market. It's not a bolt-on. It has to come first, and you have to be firm in this. Otherwise, over time, you run the risk of once again ending up with a partially documented API, which may or may not kind of work. And for every missing thing, developer frustration will grow. And with that comes the opportunity for your competitors to swipe your customers by filling that gap. So write the docs. Okay. Let's talk about SDKs. So next up, you're going to want to start thinking about the SDKs you might want to offer. SDKs represent a great opportunity to not only make interacting with your API simpler, but also shape how developers will interact with them and your platform. Now, if you're lucky, you may already have some awareness of what kind of programming languages you expect your audience to use. And if you do, then target those languages. But if you don't, where do you start? Well, an old adage I like to live by is don't try and learn something new when you're trying to build something useful. And what I mean by that is if you're building an SDK for your service for the first time, don't try and build it in the new hotness or what you think is going to be the coolest thing to build it in. Build it in what you already know. If your technology is built with Java and you know Java, build your first SDK with Java. If your technology is built with Node.js, same thing, build it with Node.js. Stick to what you know and expand later. Because the first SDK you build is going to become the template for the SDKs you build in the future. And if you've tried to build your first SDK with language you've just started to learn, honestly, it's going to be a mess. Don't spend that time learning the tech and building your SDK. Build your SDK with the tech you know, and use that as the foundation for the thing you want to learn in the future. This will get you to market quicker and with a stabler product. And one of the nice things about building your first SDK this way is that it's never been easier to later have that SDK converted into a new language. With large language models like Llama, ChatGPT, and Copilot, you can funnel in your nice, well-thought-out SDK and ask it for a version in another language. It may take some tweaking, but it will be a better foundation on which to build than you picking up a new language for the first time. SDKs also represent an opportunity for you to make things easier for your developers than it might be through interacting with something like curl or their preferred language's built-in HTTP module. Take authentication, for example. Authenticating with your API might be a couple of requests. First, validating a user's credentials, then another request to generate a token, and then a final third request that may imbue that token with certain properties and abilities. When using an SDK, aspects of that functionality can be abstracted away into a single convenience function so that the developer never has to think about it again. And again, it's faster, simpler, you get greater satisfaction from your developers. They don't want to spend time building code to work with your product. They want to spend time using your product to build their own. Make it as easy as possible for them. And then document it. I'm going to keep coming back to this, but document what you're shipping. The amount of times I've heard someone say the code is self-documenting, I swear to God, my eyes can't roll any harder. While someone can take the time to read your code before they start building with it, I guarantee it won't be as simple as just reading someone else's SDK documentation. While you may have amazing code that you and future generations of your family can be proud of, documentation of SDKs provides something special that can otherwise wholly be missed, and that is context. Context is king. And with SDK documentation, you can start to create narratives and patterns that form the basis of the next subject we're going to discuss. And that is education. How are you going to educate people on what they can build with your shiny new API and the tools you've built for them to use? It's through developer education. Now, this can take many different forms. None are better or worse than any others, but each have their own strengths and weaknesses they need to be considered. And all of them can be presented in one or more media. But as with all things, start at the beginning. And you can do this with a 101. Now, these can be self-guided workshops, walkthroughs, or just a simple list of steps to get people onboarded with the simplest of applications with your API. The hello worlds and things like authenticating, creating users, the super basic stuff. And it's upon this rock that you can build your church. Because if you take the time to educate your customers on the simplest use of your API and its features in a standalone atomic format, you can refer to them in other, more detailed pieces of content later on where you can refer people to these materials. So instead of having to walk people through the nitty-gritty of getting set up with CLI tools or SDKs or user credentials, you can point to the materials and say, follow these things if you haven't done so already before following this content. It lets you focus on the deeper dive stuff when you're talking about it. And importantly, you have a single resource that you can maintain and change. So if something does change fundamentally about how you interact with your API, you don't have to go and find every example ever written or published about how to do that one thing. You have to find one resource to go and change. And by doing that, everything that's hooked into it will still be valid. So you're saving yourself a lot of work in the long run. Once you've got the fundamentals out of the way, there's a whole array of content that you can create to empower people to build with a new shiny API. And those are deep dives and demos and snippets and recipes. Deep dives are great. They give you the chance to document the power of your API when it's used to its full potential. And it gives you the opportunity to showcase the not often used and potentially super powerful aspects of your API. And deep dives work well both in written and presented form, like live streams, recorded sessions, or workshops, for example. If you're looking for the kind of subjects that you can cover, look internally first. You're bringing this thing to market because you found it useful, and you think others will find it useful too. So talk about that. Use what you've built as the foundation for something that others can build as well, and listen to the feedback you get from those sessions. If people are telling you they're struggling with a particular aspect of your API, or if they're asking you a lot of questions about some other part of your service, those are the things you should be talking about too. We also have demos, which are a compelling way to give people a quick first-hand experience of what a successful integration with your API looks like. They can act as a sort of shop window for look what you can have as you come inside. But they are often a higher undertaking and usually require a lot more support in the long term. So if you're going to do demos, make sure it's one that you're happy to invest time, not just building, but also maintaining as time goes on, especially if it becomes popular. And finally, there are code snippets, otherwise known as patterns or recipes. And these are small chunks of code that do what they say on the tin. Looking to authenticate with a service without having to write any of your own code, then there's a recipe for that. Want to add something to the database behind our service? There's a recipe for that too. And there are recipes everywhere. They're super useful ways for getting people off the ground quickly once they've read your docs and decided that, yes, this is something that we should explore building with. At Moneyhub, we spent a lot of time on our recipes, so you can get started with open banking and open finance in something like 30 seconds. We found they're a really powerful way to open developers' eyes to the possibilities of our platform without making them jump through a ton of hoops to get there. And that leads us to pricing. You've got the product, you've got the content, you're getting ready to flip the switch on this thing. But the big question remains, how much are you going to charge for it? How are people going to pay for it? How often does billing occur? Is there a licensing agreement involved? All of these are super, super important questions to answer. And they'll vary wildly based on your API. So I'm not even going to attempt to do that for you, but I am going to focus on two things that you absolutely will need sooner or later. And that is a light tier and an enterprise tier. Now let's talk about those two options and why you really should have them. What happens in the middle of that spectrum is up to you, but I'm a strong advocate of you having both of these options when you go to market. So let's talk about that light tier first. When a developer comes to your new shiny API, they're looking to solve a problem. And either through a Google search, speaking to someone they know, maybe even a large language model these days, they think that you might have the answer to their problem. And they'll take a look around, maybe look at the docs, maybe even start thinking about how they're going to integrate your product into theirs. But one question will sit in their minds. How much is it going to cost to build on your platform? Now, the developer themselves may not have to pay for your service specifically, but more likely than not, there'll be inside an organization which deals with the expenditure for them. But they're still going to be the ones that have to justify that expense. In the vast majority of modern software purchasing decisions, it's the developer who will decide whether your product gets the yay or the nay when it comes to purchasing your product. Now, a light tier serves to give limited, cheap, maybe even sometimes free access to your platform so developers can audit and assess it. They want to see that it can work at a prototype stage before they invest the time and money into building on top of your platform. A light tier gives them the opportunity to access your platform at the cost of a few bucks that nobody will really miss. If you have a pricing strategy that starts much higher than those few bucks, it's running the risk of becoming a blocker. Sure, the dev may go away and find the person they need to say yes or no to them splashing out a bit of cash in order to get started. But that's a process that can take time, and time is money, especially in software engineering. They're likely going to go and find a competing service instead, which offers a cheaper, faster way to get started quickly in order to get going with their product. You can have the best technology in the world, but if you don't have a light tier, which makes it accessible to people to try out, your competition is going to eat that opportunity up. By letting developers into the ecosystem just a little bit for a little bit of money, you're on your way to them deciding to invest in your platform for the big time. They can start to see the results. They can see that it works. And they know that as they grow, your product can grow with them too. And that leads us quite nicely to the enterprise tier. The opposite end of the scale is the enterprise tier. When a developer comes along to your platform and sees that it can do what they need it to do, the business is going to want guarantees about how your platform works. And this is where you'll have SLAs about uptime, support contracts for out-of-hours issues, possibly even a specific person assigned to the customer to help them as they grow. And enterprise pricing is a little trickier than light tier pricing, because whereas a light tier is intended to be as close to a kind of one-size-fits-all offering as possible, an enterprise tier is usually a bespoke proposition because no two customers are the same. Some customers may be more focused on the throughput that your platform can handle. Some customers may be more interested in the unit pricing for the volume of requests that they're going to funnel through your API. Maybe someone just wants some super low single-digit latency whenever they hit your services. It doesn't matter all that much. When you have a customer that's looking for the extra guarantee that investing their time and money in you is one that's going to benefit them, you're presented with the opportunity to build a relationship with them, to understand their needs and work hand in hand with them to build out their products and services with you. And enterprising is also great because they don't tend to be plans that are charged on a month-by-month basis. They tend to run over a period of years. So you can count on that money coming in and build your business accordingly as its use roll by. But what if a customer uses too much of our service, I hear you ask? Well, that's for you and your contract to figure out. You can have shorter term contracts, which enable you to assess and renegotiate based on usage and throughput, or you can have longer term contracts that have built-in caps. Or frankly, sometimes you may just have to eat a tiny little bit less profit. In that instance, when the time comes to renegotiate, years will have passed by, and you really ought to have a good idea of what these people are going to use your API for, what it's going to cost you to provide it, and how you should have the data to price that for your expected profit margins. If you're not at a point where you're thinking about enterprise pricing, larger customers are going to be at the point where they may be hesitant to engage with you. You're not thinking about them, why would they think about you? So get your light tier sorted, get your enterprise tier sorted. The middle is up to you, but those two ends are vital. Now, marketing. Well, marketing is a tricky one, as audiences, messages, and of course your product can vary wildly depending on what you're bringing to market. I don't know what you're planning to build, and I would never presume to tell you how to share something you should rightly be excited about with your customers. Now, if this isn't your first rodeo, you'll likely have established processes and communication channels set up between you and the users for your existing products, in which case, lean on those processes and people that you have set up to date. Your marketers should have those channels, such as email and social media, for example, already set up that you can hook into. Work with them to craft the messaging that you want your audience to hear the first time they learn about your product. But let's say this is the first time you're taking an internal API to market. Maybe you haven't offered a SaaS product before. Maybe you're still a really early stage company. It doesn't really matter. You're on the ground floor. Where do you start? Well, much like the documentation step we gathered earlier, gather all of the information you have internally and then start piecing together the 5 W's. Who, what, where, when, and why. And don't forget their good buddy, H for how. It is, what have you built? For whom is it going to be useful? Where can they get started? When can they get started? Why should they care about your service? And how can they get going? There's a reason these questions are the foundation for almost every news article you've ever read. It's a really good way to share a lot of information in a very brief space of time. Audiences have the shortest attention span they've had for decades. And when you first decide to talk to someone about their product, about your product, you have seconds at best to hook a potential customer in and get them to invest the full 30 seconds it will take for them to digest what you're reaching out to them for. Use that opportunity to link to your documentation, link to your SDKs, link to your product page, and importantly, give people a way to get in touch if they want to learn more at a deeper level. Flash in the pan communications aren't going to be enough. You want to build almost a conversation between yourself and your audience. Make them feel like they're part of the journey with you. To that end, try and let your audience know when new things are happening. While your API may not be the exact fit someone is looking for right now when you launch, as it grows in features, it may come to be a more appealing option for the things that they're looking to solve. Let people know everything, no matter how small it is. Through consistent communication, people can see that you're investing the time to grow your service, that they too should be able to envision investing their time in your product too. And that brings us quite nicely to the end of the presentation. Write your documentation, build your SDKs, educate your developers, price for the long tail and the short tail, and speak to your audience. I've been Tracey, and thank you for your time.